Today's podcast is about a man going through a transition. He had a milestone birthday coming up, and he wanted to finish out his 40s in the way that he had dreamed of. After many years of city living, he longed for more peaceful surroundings, and he had some goals that he wanted to accomplish. Everything seemed to be going well with that, until it wasn't. What started out as a nice hike late one afternoon would begin a mystery that we are still trying to figure out almost 38 years later. Let's talk about Keith Reinhard. Keith Reinhard was a 49-year-old sports writer who lived at 1155 Cary Road in Algonquin, Illinois. He was successful in his chosen field and had spent 22 years covering high school sports and was based out of the Chicago area. He lived there with his wife of 3 years, Carolyn. He also had 3 grown children, Kai, Sven, and Tiffany. With his 50th birthday coming up, he was ready to do some things that he had always wanted to do. One of his goals was to get in shape by mountain climbing. He also had a fear of heights that he wanted to conquer. Keith would also begin work on a novel. These 3 things will all play a factor in this mystery. Keith would leave work for a 3-month sabbatical on June 15, 1988. Described as a free spirit with an interest in photography and panning for gold, he would make his temporary home in Silver Plume, Colorado. It was an old mining town near the Rocky Mountains, and in 1988 it had a population of less than 200. Another factor in him deciding to relocate to the small town was that Keith's friend since childhood, Ted Parker, lived there and ran a cafe in Silver Plume. During this time, Keith wanted to enjoy the end of his 40s and hoped to be successful so that he and his wife could relocate there permanently. Keith would rent out a small apartment in the back of an abandoned Catholic church. He also rented a tiny shop where he sold antiques and photography. 9 months before Keith rented out the shop, it had been a bookstore. Tom Young was a 47-year-old former teacher and veteran of the Army Special Forces who enjoyed traveling. He had run the Charing Cross bookstore in Silver Plume, which specialized in travel guides, for about a year. On September 8, 1987, Tom Young would take his beloved Labrador Retriever Gus and tell everyone that he was leaving on a European vacation. 3 weeks would go by and no one heard from or saw him. He stopped picking his mail up. His 75-year-old mother, Louise Burks, had not heard from him, and he had told her nothing about his European vacation plans. His Chevy Blazer was still parked at his residence. Everyone began to get suspicious. Finally, on October 23, 1987, Tom Young was officially reported missing. Keith Reinhard would become intrigued by Young's disappearance. He was a writer and curious by nature, and his curiosity would soon give way to obsession. Keith would talk to everyone in town that knew Tom Young. He even decided to base his novel on Tom Young and created a character named Guy Gypsum that was a cross between himself and Young. It seemed like Keith Reinhard was getting swept up in the mystery. But this mystery would soon give way to mourning. On July 31, 1988, 10 months after Tom Young would leave on his supposed European vacation, 2 hunters, while exploring for the upcoming bow hunting season, would find human skeletal remains, as well as a dog's remains, under a weathered tarp in the mountains near Silver Plume. Each had a gunshot wound to the head, with a gun being found nearby. Tests would determine that the remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. An investigation revealed that Tom Young had purchased a gun just 4 days before he disappeared. Tom Young's case was soon ruled a suicide and was closed by Clear Creek County Sheriff's Department. Finding Tom Young's remains only seemed to deepen Keith Reinhard's obsession with this mystery. Keith's daughter Tiffany would say that it was sometimes hard for her father to tell the difference between fact and fiction. She said that writers sometimes like to live the story they're writing about. It seemed that Keith Reinhard wasn't just writing about this mystery. He was in a sense now living it. On Wednesday night, August 3, 1988, Keith Reinhard would attend a memorial service for Tom Young. That Saturday, August 6th, a Denver radio station hosted a beer party in Silver Plume. It was said that there were 400 people in attendance, more than the entire population of Silver Plume at the time. Witnesses say that Reinhard would spend the evening drinking beer and swapping theories on what happened to Tom Young. Despite the official ruling, Reinhard was said to be adamant that Tom Young's death was not a suicide. On Sunday, August 7, 1988, a week after Tom Young's remains were found, Keith Reinhard closed up his shop around 2:30 p.m. He reportedly walked through Silver Plume and told several residents that he was going to climb to the top of nearby Pendleton Mountain. They really didn't take him seriously because they knew that he didn't like climbing alone and that he had a fear of heights. He then went to his friend Ted Parker's cafe about 4 p.m. and told his friend his plans and said that he would make it to the top of the mountain. Keith told Ted that if he did not come back, he should call on the rescue. Ted did not take him seriously. Keith then told him goodbye, and according to newspaper reports, was last seen leaving a general store with a can of pop in hand and walking towards Pendleton Mountain at 4:30 p.m. Everyone said that 4:30 p.m. was much too late to hike up the mountain, as that journey would normally take 6 hours. Keith only wore jeans, a t-shirt, flannel shirt, and tennis shoes with no jacket. He also took no supplies with him. Keith Reinhardt's ascent up the mountain was surprising enough, but the townspeople were even more surprised when he didn't come down from them. Just as Keith Reinhardt advised his friend in the event that he didn't come down, the next morning the rescue was called. The search was comprehensive on Pendleton Mountain. Helicopters, more than 125 men, and a dozen trained dogs would search the terrain for 7 days. Pendleton Mountain has a height of 12,275 feet and is covered with boulders, rocks, and 50-foot drops hidden by thick forests. It consisted of 3,000 vertical feet of 60-degree slope. It was one of the toughest areas they had ever covered. The fact that Keith only walked up the mountain with the clothes on his back and wearing tennis shoes meant there were no clues to find, such as a backpack or supplies. In 30 years of operations, the Colorado Alpine Rescue Team had found every single person they had searched for, but they could not find Keith Reinhardt. In an already scary and sad situation with Keith Reinhardt now being missing, there would be a tragedy involved in the search for him. First, one of the workers would experience altitude sickness, suffering dehydration and vomiting. Sadly, the day prior, 40-year-old pilot Terry Leedens would die when the plane he was piloting in the search crashed in the dense timber on the mountain. His passenger, Dan Drobny, would also be seriously injured. Despite their best efforts, all of the searching led to no clues or trace of Keith Reinhardt. Keith's friends and co-workers back in Illinois were saddened to hear of his disappearance. Keith's friend and fellow sports writer Jim O'Donnell would even organize a fundraiser to raise funds to hire a private investigator to help in the search. On December 18, 1988, they held the benefit at Mike Ditka's Trackside in Arlington Heights. It was titled A Night of Friends and included appearances by local sports and media celebrities. Mike Ditka would even purchase the first 2 tickets to the event, choosing numbers 1 and 89, 89 being his old jersey number. In all, about 850 people would gather at the benefit, and O'Donnell said that he expected the night to gross more than his original goal of $20,000. This would earn enough to hire a PI to aid in investigating the disappearance. In a newspaper article promoting the benefit, Keith's wife, Carolyn Reinhardt, would say that she thought hiring a private investigator was a good idea. She thought it was perhaps the next logical step. When asked whether or not she thought her husband was still alive, she said, "Being so close to the situation, I'm not sure what I think." She went on to say that she appreciated the support from friends and family and appreciated those who put the fundraiser together. Unsolved Mysteries would film the recreation of the disappearance in June of 1989. Ward Roberts of Golden, Colorado would portray Reinhardt. Ted Parker would watch the segment but actor Don Dorial of Denver portrayed him. Parker would say, "It digs up some memories, but not good ones. All the numbness reappears." The segment would not air until early 1990, and it produced a lot of calls, but ultimately did not result in locating Keith Reinhard. We'll continue with Keith's story soon, but first, I recently celebrated the 8th anniversary of my blog. I always like to release a special article and podcast episode around that time. My guest today is someone that I've been wanting to join me on my podcast, basically since I first started it. We've been friends for years and have worked on projects together in the past, and hopefully will continue to in the future. There is a specific reason why I've chosen him to be my guest for this particular mystery, and we'll talk about why. Please welcome Eric Walter to my podcast.
Hi, Heather. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good to be here with you. You're right. It's been a long time. I'm glad we can finally do this and talk about this on EdLink.
I'm thrilled to have you join me, Eric. So a little background. I've been thinking back to when we first met several years ago, and it was because of the Unsolved Mysteries board on Sitcoms Online that I was moderating. We are both a couple of hardcore Unsolved Mysteries nerds for sure. We even joke that every time we talk on the phone, it's basically a true crime podcast episode.
That is very true. My gosh, any of our conversations definitely probably should have been recorded. There's tidbits I'll not remember now, but it's so funny how we met because just doing online sleuthing almost 2 decades ago or more at this point. I was, I knew you were very prominent on there as far as being a moderator on the boards pertaining to Unsolved Mysteries cases, which I was sort of obsessed with. A few in particular, I would say. It wasn't necessarily, I was huge, and am a huge fan of the original series, especially the first several seasons that were shot on film. Being a filmmaker and a documentarian, I always really loved their moody, their recreations are sort of get made fun of, and I think rightly so in terms of, them feeling dated and all the rest of it. However, I was a huge fan of just when Unsolved used sort of the real subjects within their own recreations.
Yeah, that's true.
Sometimes, a lot of times they would use even suspects within their own recreations, which I thought was something kind of fascinating, and I still do. So, I don't know. I just was a huge fan of the show, and I basically couldn't put down some of these cases and began researching them obsessively myself.
I feel like with you and I, it's both missing persons that really gets our interest.
Yeah, and the obscure missing persons cases, the ones that are, I think the more obscure the better. I don't know why that is for me, but the ones that are the most difficult in terms of what happened, I think Unsolved Mysteries, while it's a great program, and as a filmmaker and storyteller, I can totally understand why they went the direction they did in terms of their format, but they tended to play up sort of the drama of a lot of, the conspiratorial ends of certain, I think they did present most theories, but I think there's some instances where they would play up the conspiratorial or dramatic end of something more than the eventual likelihood, which I think will pertain to talking to Keith Reinhardt's case, actually, a little bit when we get into this. But I think sorting out that as far as the details of certain cases of what really happened, because, I know you know this, so many of the people interviewed for that case either have passed, cases on Unsolved Mysteries rather, have passed away, or people, remember things differently in the past, or they're not wanting to talk about it now. There's one case in particular, not Reinhardt's, but another one that I've been working on where there's certain individuals who talked then, but now they don't want to talk. And a lot of these witnesses, interestingly, have become synonymous with the stories that they were featured on because of Unsolved Mysteries.
Yeah.
And so, there's people like yourself and myself who have continued to probe into this either professionally or non-professionally, just people emailing, asking, connecting with someone's social media. So I think there's a certain stigma. Some people just don't want to be bothered, and some people do. So it's like anything else. It's just the connectivity, I think, these days. It's like, they've been haunted by these segments that they were in, which I think is kind of an interesting. So it's been a lot of that. And anytime you get involved in these, these old cold cases, it's especially the ones that we're talking about with missing persons.
Yeah. So
there's varying levels of detail that is out there.
Yes, exactly. So the case that we're going to talk about today is one that you and I have talked about for years, and that is the disappearance of Keith Reinhard. Some of you may know, and some of you may not know, that Eric has worked extensively on this case. In fact, he's made an as-of-yet unreleased documentary devoted to this mystery, but we'll talk about the doc a little later in the podcast. I do appreciate you talking with me about all that you've learned, and I do understand that there are some things that you want to save for when people watch the documentary, and I totally understand that. Please first tell us what you do for a living, because I think that is noteworthy when we talk about the documentary.
Yes, I primarily I work in the film and television industry as an editor. That's my sort of day-to-day activities. However, I work heavily in the documentary field as well as the narrative field, just as a director, writer, and producer on my own right. Have produced feature documentaries, one most notable being My Amityville Horror from 2013, which is the feature doc about Daniel Lutz, who was the oldest son of the Lutz family, who's, from the Amityville Horror case. And my editing work, primarily, I work with all of the studios, Netflix, Amazon, HBO, all the rest, day to day. So I'm working on various television series, theatrical films, theatrical trailer edits, all kinds of manner of editorial. So I'm extremely busy with all of that pretty much all the time. But my real passion has been, working, investigating cases that I'm passionate about, and working on these for many, many years.
Yeah.
as we'll soon talk about.
How long have you been doing this type of work?
I moved to Los Angeles back in 2008 and began working in the industry around, I'd say, maybe the following year. It took a little time to get my footing, just because of, at the time I moved out there, the economy was in a really bad way. As far as the film industry too was, in a very bad way, as it currently is now too. So it sort of ebbs and flows. But so about 17 years professionally in the industry. Before that, I've always been writing and producing independent projects my entire life. Originally from Maryland, and so I'm an East Coaster at heart, but have been working in, out in Los Angeles and in California in general for almost 2 decades now.
What made you decide to dig into the case? What was the pull for you about Keith's case?
As we talked about with Unsolved Mysteries, the television show, admittedly, that is how I first learned of the case. As at a very early age, I had seen a rebroadcast in the 90s of that segment. And I think, as we talked about with obscure endings to a case or non-endings, what the hell happened to this guy? I think I was fascinated with this. For people who don't know, I don't want to bury the lead, but basically Keith Reinhard had moved to Silver Plume, Colorado, which is a small, what they call a living ghost town, which in 1988, when he moved there, this town, and it still is, a small, quaint, former mining town, silver mining town from the 1890s. And, during, following the silver crash, became a ghost town. Down in the 1950s, I've been told by other residents there that the town itself got down to, 40 to 50 people.
Wow.
During its heyday, I've been told it was near 3,000 people. So, it tells you a lot. Before a highway was put in there, which is the I-70 going from Denver, it's about an hour west of Denver on the 70 freeway. But, going up in the mountains up there, it's extremely remote, especially before that highway. So, the town itself is, a moody place. I think I was very attracted to just all of the folklore, the stories, the myths, the legends that come out of that era and through that town. And like I say, it's beautiful, but it's also eerie and moody. And I think Keith Reinhard was also very interested in that history, as well as the atmosphere. He romanticized a lot about it, as did I, sort of. And I think that's what initially attracted to me. He was writing, and that was, as Unsolved Mystery segment talks about, Keith was involved in researching the disappearance of an acquaintance, friend, person who lived in the town 11 months prior, who was named Tom Young. He was a bookseller who vanished in September of 1987. And Keith was involved in writing a novel about Tom Young, and sort of romanticizing this disappearance and what might have happened to him. And so when Keith Reinhard disappeared himself in 1988, only 5 days after Tom Young's remains were found, this was something that I of course, it's like a mind-blowing story, and I was sort of obsessed with finding out what was in that manuscript, what was Keith writing, because, the Unsolved Mysteries segment only outlined a very short paragraph, if that. I believe was only like a line or two from the ending, which is, part of the most mysterious story. But the entire, I can say, I can't go into all the details yet, but my film will certainly go into all the details of what is contained in that writing.
Yes.
And what drove me to get involved in it. It was that I was fascinated not only with this sort of double disappearance in a close, fragment of time, but also just the fact that Keith Reinhard was sort of interested, obsessed with investigating and writing about Tom Young, and a very similar incident happened to him. So I just simply wanted to know what happened to him. And being a documentary filmmaker, I became involved with many, many years of going back to the town, befriending people who lived in the town. And I've just been very close with these people for many, many years. And it's been a massive ton of work that I've done on this case that continues to this day.
And I know that you do know Keith's family, so what are your impressions of them, and what do they think happened?
Yeah, I mean, the film will certainly it will let you know. I don't want to speak for them, but it will, because each of them, I would have to break it down into what each of them think. But I will say, without getting into too many details, that the Reinhard family each sort of think something different, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And I think is sort of a reflection on the issues, the theme of my film, as well as the issues with this case. But first off, the Reinhard family, they're wonderful. I mean, truly wonderful. I'm consider them close friends, and that is a slight issue, I would say, as far as a documentarian not wanting to be too close with his subjects. However, in this case, I haven't let those, my friendship of the family sort of color my objectivity. I never would do that in terms of what happened, because there's a lot of stuff that is talked about in this film that I think is uncomfortable for them. But that's sort of my job, with wanting to tell the story accurately, and it's hard to tell a story accurately that's so mired in mystery. But the family, I would say, candidly, is in various degrees of, it is very much in the past for them, but they've been left. I feel when I first began, the first person I reached out to was Tiffany Reinhard, who is Keith's daughter. She's featured in Unsolved Mysteries, and I had just found out that as I was working as an editor, this is many years ago, and that she actually worked at the time she was working in the building beside me.
Oh wow!
So, which I only found I had begun doing research on the case, and I had been to Silver Plume, and she worked also in the film industry as basically worked in finance, and so I was thrilled to find out that she was local, and I just asked her, let's go to lunch and talk about this. It really wasn't a documentary project at that point. There's many, many years of research that goes into this before at least with me, I like to be, this about me, Heather. I love to be, I'm extremely thorough, and I don't like to put my opinions out there based on, how would I term it? Information that is sourced online only, because if anything, my film will show and reveal is that a lot of that gobbledygook that comes from Wikipedia and even Unsolved Mysteries website, not just that, but a lot of these things get passed down, repeated, and they're all misnomers and outright lies, some of them. So, I was interested in, not only what did they think happened, but how had all of that affected them? Because, the Reinhard case in particular, and Tom Young's, who have been conjoined basically post-mortem, if you believe Keith is dead or not. Yeah. But either way, both are still missing, or I'm sorry, Keith is missing, Tom has been found, but there's still a immense mystery surrounding his death. And so they've been conjoined, because of their demises. And so how had that affected their viewpoint of the case? How had it colored? And with Tiffany, I would say it's been interesting because at the beginning, she was very much, and again, I don't want to speak for her, but you'll see in the film, she was very much, I would say she had resigned herself that it very likely was an accident that had happened. However, when certain points of the story that are so hard to move past in terms of the coincidental nature of things that happened between Tom Young's life and Keith Reinhardt's life, and other things in the past of Silver Plume, you can't help but be influenced to think there's something else. So I've just witnessed between all of the family members that there might have been something more to this. And I can talk about my own opinions on that, later on, because I also I certainly have a predominant theory, but I don't know absolutely for sure. As far as Keith goes, what actually happened, none of us do.
Yeah, and while we're talking about the family, I know that one of Keith's sons, and I believe he was interviewed on the Unsolved Mystery segment, he passed away several years ago. So tell us what you know about that.
Yeah, Keith's oldest son, Sven Reinhard, tragically passed away it was unfortunately a carbon monoxide incident involving him and a friend driving a bus back from Colorado to California, and unfortunately, they were sleeping in the bus, and there was a carbon monoxide leak, and unfortunately, Sven passed. And it was a really, I know in particular, each of them were horribly affected by this, as you can, I'm sure you can understand. But particularly Keith's first wife, who was the mother of his three kids. Sven, Kai, and Tiffany. And the passing of Sven was, extremely hard on the family, and especially for Astrid Reinhard, who is Keith's first wife. who is a lovely, lovely person. Incredible storyteller, has incredible memories about everything that happened, and her perspective on things are definitely featured in the film heavily. I think it will surprise a lot of people, some of the things that are remembered and talked about, because I think that's another thing that I'm very happy with, is having captured so many of these memories over many, many years. A lot of these people years down the road won't be with us anymore. So I am proud of the fact that I've been able to, capture points in time that even when I started them is a long time ago now. So it is kind of interesting. But yeah, Sven, I would love, obviously, I wish he was still here. And I've been told by Kai and Tiffany that he was sort of the most like his dad, Keith, actually. He was sort of a scholar as far as his writing and his talents for writing. And I've seen all these, photographs of him at a typewriter. And he also looked the most like Keith, I would say, when he was still with us. But yeah, a real tragic incident.
Yeah.
And but I have been told that by Tiffany that, those two lived together, actually. Tiffany and Sven both actually worked in the film industry. Tiffany had gotten Sven involved in working in the film industry, and they had worked on numerous movies out in Los Angeles back in the, late 80s, early 90s, throughout the 90s. And she's told me that Sven believed there was something more sinister that happened to their dad.
Now, the listeners might be surprised to know that you've actually climbed Pendleton Mountain, like Keith Reinhard did or tried to do. Tell us about that experience and who climbed with you, because that is a pretty amazing story.
That is true, and I've not only climbed it once, I've done it multiple times.
Wow.
From the frontage, the side of the mountain that Keith Reinhard was said to have walked up, although, to be clear, no one truly knows what side of the mountain he was ascending, if that is even what happened. But yeah, the face of Pendleton Mountain from Silver Plume, the shadowy side, the dark side of the mountain, as it's been called, is sort of the area most notable with being where Keith said he was going to hike. He basically left town on August 7th, around, it's been said, between 3 to 5 p.m. There was sort of a 2-hour period where he was going around town telling everyone that, and some people, I should note, people he didn't know that well or at all, which is notable in the case. He was making a point of telling numerous people on his way out of town that he was going to hike to the peak of Pendleton Mountain. And for anyone who doesn't know, if you don't live in the mountains or live in Colorado, you do not leave that late in the day for a hike like that. That in and of itself makes absolutely no sense. And while Keith was a Chicago news writer, he had visited and lived in Silver Plume for 3 months at that point. But he also had been visiting Colorado and Silver Plume, and he had been on many, many hikes over the decades. I mean, he had been going to Silver Plume and knew that area incredibly well. He had a very, very close friend named Ted Parker who owned this building, the KP building, which is the Knights of Pythias building, which is an old building that Ted sort of built up, restored himself from scratch from the early 1980s onward. And Keith had, those two had known each other since childhood. They were about 10 years apart, with Ted being younger. But those two had kept very close. And after his divorce, Ted Parker had moved from Boulder to Silver Plume. And Keith had been visiting Ted for many, many years. And Keith wrote many, many letters to family members detailing his summer in Silver Plume, which was sort of a sabbatical from his job. He was sort of gotten burned out with writing
Yeah.
for this, as one can imagine. He was an incredible writer, but he was sort of burnt out from writing, local sports columns, and, it was sort of a high school sports scene.
Mm-hmm.
He was such an incredibly talented writer in terms of, I've read so many and have copies of all of his original articles, which are featured in the film heavily. But it's all to make the point that he did that for 22 years at the Daily Herald in suburban Chicago. And he was there to telling people that he was going to go work on this novel that he was going to write. He was going to investigate this Tom Young's disappearance. He was going to go hiking and be in nature. Meanwhile, he left his wife of 3 years, his second wife, Carolyn, at home, which is interesting.
Yeah, I never really understood that part.
Well, no one really has understood it into great detail, because I think my own opinion is that Carolyn's statements about what happened have been guarded, as far as
Yes.
no one really totally understands why, what might have been going on at that time in terms of their marriage. I'm not suggesting there was something going on that was, there were any problems, but I have been told by other family members that there indeed were issues.
Yeah.
But that being what it is, Keith also was a dreamer, and he was a creative, he was an artist, he was a writer, he was about to turn 50, and he did not want to be working a dead-end job and doing the run-of-the-mill thing, and he wanted to go write, and took a sabbatical by himself in the mountains. So while that may seem very strange for most people, as an artist, I can totally understand why he did what he did. But without Keith being here to tell you exactly why, all we can rely on are his letters that he left. And getting back to the point I'm meandering from, he basically, he did talk extensively about hikes that he had taken on Pendleton Mountain, one of which happened, I believe, about a week before his disappearance. He had taken a massive hike up Pendleton Mountain, where he he had experienced, this extreme case of vertigo.
Oh, wow.
And he was with Ted Parker at the time, and Ted had to coerce him down. And Keith even says in the letter that, he basically resigned himself to being, having to sit up there and wait for the chopper to come save him, because he was that terrified. And I can tell you, having hiked that mountain myself, it is not only treacherous is not the word. It's like a 50-degree slope.
Yeah.
We're going, straight up a mountain. You've got all kinds of, jutted out rocks within underbrush. I mean, the underbrush cannot be overstated enough.
Mm-hmm.
I could easily see how, if someone would slip and fall anywhere in there, that they could not be found. Because either wildlife would do away with you, or, it's just, there are no trails.
Yeah.
There's no one to help you. I mean, it is not an area you would go hike by yourself, especially towards 5 o'clock in the evening.
Yes.
So all of this did not land. The people of Silver Plume still to this day are highly skeptical of what Keith alleges happened, or, that he alleges what he was saying is what he did.
Yeah.
But having hiked that mountain, you asked who I went with. The production team and I coordinated several searches of the mountain. Even all these, decades later, we worked with original team members from the Alpine Rescue Team, who were formerly with the Alpine Rescue Team, I should say. One of which is Bill Butler, who was, unfortunately now deceased, but Bill was, an absolutely incredible resource, pragmatic, mind. He did not give into any sort of conspiracy talk at all in terms of this case. He was very, very, very intelligent. But he was also, he was a geologist as well as a forensic scientist, and he was able to sort of, working with him, put together a team who, ascended the mountains several times on camera, and we were able to just, investigate ourselves. But it was mostly for film, footage in the film to show, how treacherous this terrain was. But certainly we were keeping, Bill trained sort of everybody to keep their eyes peeled, to be looking at certain places. And, it's one of those things that, having been up there and spent a lot of time up there, Kai, Reinhard, and I have ATV'd up the back side of the mountain all the way to the top, looking down, because Keith had told people that he was heading up to this point on the mountain where there's, the framework of an old gondola up there, which is in a sense fallen, unfortunately. But at the time we were filming, we've got all that on camera. But basically, Keith gave a lot of mixed messages, because a lot of people in the town, that's what they remember Keith saying, that he was headed up to that point, Sunrise Peak on Pendleton Mountain, and others said he was headed a different direction or another direction, or, so was Keith, the question has been, was Keith planting seeds with people that didn't connect intentionally, or did people misremember it and not remember where he said he was going? It is fascinating.
Let me just ask you too, have any clues been found up there? Because there's some mention online that someone even said that they found his driver's license up there, but I wanted you to address that.
No, all of that, please. I wish that someone could delete those things, because all of that is complete BS. Nothing has been found, and I've worked with the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office as well as the Alpine Rescue Team on this, and seen the files and worked, in depth on this case. Nothing has ever been found up there that corresponds to either of these disappearances. And the only thing that did happen during the actual search was a bloodhound, Bill Butler's, a bloodhound working with Bill Butler and another team member, was basically using one of Keith's boots from this, there was this, back room in church, Overplume, that Keith was living. He was renting a small apartment back there, and this is where he was doing a lot of his writing at the time. And they used Keith's boot as a scent article. And so the bloodhound led them from the church apartment all the way to the frontage road and up into, they were ascending the mountain, and the dog was on a trail. Bill Butler has been adamant about this. The dog was on a trail. It was following a scent trail of Keith Reinhard. Unfortunately, the team, the terrain was so treacherous. This was at the beginning of the search. This was, I believe, this was on the first day of the search that this happened. And so it would have been very, very soon after. If you know anything about, I actually learned quite a bit about bloodhound, working with bloodhounds. We actually had a bloodhound on one of our searches as well for this, which was organized by Bill. But in terms of the pheromones corridor that's laid, in terms of dogs following a scent, it's really fascinating work that's done. But they unfortunately had to pull this dog off of the trail because the terrain was so treacherous they could not continue. And so when they tried to get the dog back on the trail, they weren't able to get any, they weren't able to reestablish the trail once they were prepared. But I often think, what would have happened if they had continued on that trail? Would the dog have located Keith Reinhard up there somewhere? Or there was another point later that day where they took a Chinook helicopter. There were, the military got involved. I mean, I think, to the ire of many people in Silver Plume who were upset with the level of hoop and intensity of the search that happened for Keith Reinhard, because it was, at the time, it was the most massive search and rescue operation in Colorado's history in 1988. And many Silver Plume residents were very, very irritated with that, because that type of thing, of course, hadn't happened for Tom Young, who had disappeared 11 months prior. But to be fair, no one really knew where Tom went. Keith was telling people a roundabout specific area. But Bill did fly with a Chinook helicopter to the top of Pendleton Mountain that next day with the same team. And when the dog came off the boat, there were trailing dogs, German shepherds and stuff. But this one bloodhound, Reliant was the name of the dog. Reliant basically had another hit at the top of the mountain and was trying to take them down over the edge to go down towards the face of the mountain where the dog was going up before. So Bill always told me between point A and point B, from the bottom to the top, somewhere within that big maze is probably what we're looking for. And Bill, to his dying day, believed that. And I would say that, without jumping ahead too much on my opinion, I would have to agree with him. That when you look at, the old adage, Occam's razor, I think the most likely scenario tends to be the right one.
Yeah.
However, there are still many things that I can talk about that are extremely confusing, perplexing, and mysterious that are attached to Keith's not only actions before and after his disappearance.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that.
So something I find really surprising Tom Young goes missing, I believe it was fall of 1987. Keith Reinhard doesn't arrive at Silver Plume until June of 88. So that's, we would think that he just hears about Tom Young. But there's actually a chance that Tom Young and Keith Reinhard knew each other, which I find fascinating. So tell us what you know about that.
All I can say about that, in my opinion, is they did know each other. The question is how well they knew each other, which, again, in my film, very, very much is explored, because certainly Tiffany and Kai have told me that Keith did indeed know Tom. And that Tom, being that Tom rented a shop space from Ted Parker, who was Keith's, one of Keith's very best friends in the world, mm-hmm. and that Keith had brought his kids, and that he had visited Colorado many, many times over, especially throughout the 1980s, that, Tom was there. Tom's bookshop, it was named Charing Cross. Mm-hmm. Tom was a former West Arvada high school teacher. He actually had been stationed in West Germany in the Army Special Forces, which actually added quite a bit of intrigue to sort of what happened afterward. A lot of people in town sort of tried to say that there was something that he was hiding, some sort of military knowledge or something. People spin sort of folklore about that. But I have talked to several people, one of which actually served with Tom in West Germany. And Tom Young was an interesting fellow, quiet, reserved. People in town who have told me that he was extremely intelligent, very educated. He also, I'm trying to decide how far I want to go into this and not reveal too much of my film, but there's been quite a lot talked about Tom's his sort of relationships. A lot of people in town have said that Tom was gay, and that being in a small town especially in the 1980s, I don't, my impression of Silver Plume at the time I was there is that it was extremely open and accepting of anyone's sort of orientation, which, I was certainly happy to see as far as my time there. However, during the 1980s, it was a different time. there's been a lot talked about. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but just to keep on the same track, a lot of, it's been alleged that Tom committed suicide. In fact, I shouldn't even say alleged. It really has been determined that Tom committed suicide. I know there's been a lot of questions about what happened really, but my impression is that, based on the evidence, that Tom did commit suicide. And some people in town have alleged that Tom had contracted AIDS and that he had committed suicide. That is something that has been talked quite a bit about. Whether that is true or not, I cannot tell you that is absolutely true, and no one can. In fact, there are people in town who still tell me there are things they're not willing to talk about on camera because they want to protect Tom's memory, and I completely understand that. It's anytime you're looking into a mystery of this type and there's people asking questions, people don't want Tom to be remembered through Keith Reinhard and vice versa. It's all they want Tom to be remembered as Tom Young, the bookshop owner who had this, very large black lab named Gus, which incredibly in my film I have just unbelievably beautiful archival footage that we were able to source from various news outlets that had been done about Tom's shop. And Tom, so there's interviews and things with Tom that we'll be featuring in the film that no one has ever seen before, including footage of the dog and all the rest of it. But Tom seemed like a lovely person. How much there are, as you can probably infer, there's a lot of things that I'm sort of skating around because there were certain aspects of what Tom talked about to certain people that I've interviewed these people, and some really interesting and sad things that are exposed in the film, but that weave into various aspects of what happened to Keith as well. So getting back to your original question, did these two know each other? It's my impression that they did. I've been told by Tiffany and Kai that they did know each other, and that Tiffany remembered being in the bookstore and the dog and the whole thing. So my impression is they absolutely did know each other.
Wow.
But I go back to my question of how well did they know each other, because and this is another thing where I hate to be evasive, but there's other aspects of this case, with Tom's relationship with Keith that are interesting. And Keith, all I can say is that Keith's writing is where that gets really interesting, because Keith was writing extensively sort of a fictional novel from the perspective of Tom Young, but he was weaving elements of himself. He was basically creating a composite character named Guy Gypsum, which there is a town not too far from Silver Plume, if you keep going west on the 70, a town called Gypsum, Colorado, which I can only assume, and have talked to Kai Reinhardt about that, maybe that's where he got the idea. But Keith wrote all kinds of different stories where he would just create these wild, kind of quirky, eccentric names and things like that. But Guy Gypsum essentially was a composite character of elements of himself, Keith, and Tom Young. And there's a lot explored in this story that suggests there indeed was more to their relationship. And that's all I can really say about that right now.
Okay.
But I think it absolutely plays heavily into, my impression is it does play into Keith's more motivation for going up there that day, definitely.
Yes. Okay, tell us about the nuclear waste theory and your thoughts on it.
This is where I think, this story goes a little off the rails for me. My impression is, and I have trouble even saying that, because I have talked to people who knew Keith extremely well. There is a woman who was interviewed in my film that I think people are going to be very, very surprised, because some of what is revealed, she alleges, came from Keith Reinhardt himself, that he was aware of these theories that, that there had been alleged illegal nuclear waste dumping from the Rocky Flats nuclear waste facility that had been going on in the mines, or in and around the Silver Plume area in Clear Creek County, Colorado. Now, anybody you would talk to about this in that area now, they'll laugh at you, most of them, because the idea that them driving trucks of nuclear waste to dump into mines seems absurd, because first of all, these mines are inaccessible. So the idea that, well, they're not accessible easily, I should say. They definitely are accessible. So most of them have been, been crossed off and you can't access them. And there are a lot. In fact, there's one that I went into myself during the filming that are open that you can access. Maybe not legally, but you can still access them. So basically, it's certainly possible, I suppose, but the lengths that someone would have to go to dump nuclear waste into an abandoned mine shaft defy logic, in my opinion. This all sort of got started basically from, there was a journalist who was writing about this whole story and had been spreading theories about it. I don't have to go too deep into this basically to make my point, but a lot of the theories he was spreading were conflated and wrapped into Keith and Tom's case. However, and I think that's what during the 90s and early 2000s and online, that's where a lot of these theories got seeded. But what really blew my mind is that, again, there is a woman that I interviewed who was very close to Keith Reinhard throughout his life, and at the time especially that when he was investigating Tom's disappearance that summer of '88, she alleges that Keith had told her that there was, that Tom knew about this illegal dumping and that he had witnessed it and was going to blow the whistle on whomever was responsible for this. And whether I believe that, I just can't say. I don't think that she's lying. Mm-hmm. I think she's very credible in terms of her. There would be there's no financial certainly reason for her to say that to me. There's no, maybe she's looking for attention. That's certainly possible, but I don't believe that's the case. But Keith certainly could have said that. I mean, he was, writing a book. None of that is included in what he was writing, by the way. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting that, there is someone out there that before my research into this case for the film, I absolutely didn't buy any of these theories because they just sound too outlandish to me. Mm-hmm. And also, the people who were proposing these theories, Mike Eccles is the journalist that I was referring to who wrote this book, who was sort of an addendum to his book and afterward to his book, Brothers Tony's Boys, which is a completely different topic. But he had done a whole lot of research on, alleged research on this, but he also gets a whole lot of facts wrong about Reinhard and Young in his book, and he sort of conflates different things. And he does what Unsolved Mysteries did. He sort of makes it sound more alluring and more suspicious than it actually was. He made points in his book that during the search for Keith that Tom's remains had been found. Well, that absolutely is not true. So it's just things like that. But I will say that not only the woman that I interviewed who will be revealed in my film, I don't want to give her name right now, but that is one of the big things that will be shown in the film that is very intriguing. Also from that, going to the people in Silver Plume and Idaho Springs and Georgetown, Clear Creek County, all of these people that I have talked to, there's been numerous people that I've talked to who have said that Tom knew more about this. Now, whether that's them reading it on the internet and repeating it, that's certainly, that's where I think it's coming from, but I tend not to be a subscriber to this theory. But it is, the Rocky Flats case, of course, is very real, and I actually interviewed several people for my film who were absolutely involved in this with the real case who worked at Rocky Flats. And so I absolutely did my homework in terms of, giving legitimate to the actual case itself and what really happened there. Whether that has anything to do with Reinhard and Young's case, I tend to be skeptical. But I will say that the people I talked to absolutely believed that someone researching and a journalist coming to town and doing research on Rocky Flats and what was going on could very well have been silenced by that company, the people who were running that company at the time, because there were other whistleblowers who were allegedly attempted to be silenced and threatened with death and arson and all the rest of it. So, but I personally don't believe that those two things are connected myself.
Yeah. What would you say is the thing that has surprised you the most after all of your research on this case?
Oh my gosh. My research is ongoing even to this day. I would say there's so many things that have surprised me. Honestly, anytime you take on this amount of research, you're almost like resurrecting the dead, this is especially when we're making a film about someone who is not well known outside of suburban Chicago or Silver Plume, Colorado circles, right? This Keith and Tom certainly had their moment back in, 1990 with or was it 89? I can't remember now, but whenever the Unsolved Mystery segment was initially aired, it generated a lot of tips and a lot of, it was a lot of exposure for the case, which was a great thing because otherwise I wouldn't be talking to you right now about it.
Yeah.
But I think it was surprising to sort of learn who Keith Reinhard and who Tom Young really were as people. And I think it's been my job to respectfully tell their story about who they really were, because I'm sort of walking the line of telling a story about real people, and then also how their demises, in Keith's case, disappearance, and then Tom's death, have grown legs beyond their own demise. Like, they have become intertwined. They've become legends, sort of. Their cases have grown more sinister and cast a longer and longer shadow as the years go on, because it's taken on a mythical status of being something nefarious, someone, Keith, the growing theory, as I'm sure you're going to talk about in your podcast, is, that Keith was murdered because he was investigating Tom Young's disappearance. Anything is possible. I tend to not be a subscriber to that theory. I think, you asked me the most surprising thing, I would say certainly I accomplished my goal personally of being able to read the manuscript that Keith was writing. Really threw me for a loop, because it was not what I was expecting at all. It was not as, like he was writing a mystery novel. It was more of like a psychological delve into someone's reasoning for rationalizing suicide.
Oh, wow.
Which, if Keith was writing about Tom Young, that would make sense, because at that point, Keith, like I said earlier, Keith's, Tom's body had been found. His remains had been found. He and his dog had both been shot in the head, and had been found strewn amongst bits of a green tarp that had, the police alleged that basically Tom had covered himself with a green forest-colored tarp to conceal the remains, and that he had offed himself and his dog. And the gun was found on the scene. However, the gun and the caliber of bullets that were found were never able to be conclusively matched together as being the weapon that caused this person's death and the dog's death, basically because the weapon was in such a state of decay and had been rusted over that they couldn't conclusively prove it. But again, Occam's razor, to me, that is the gun that was used, and that Tom had purchased before he disappeared, very soon before he disappeared. So again, there's still people out there who say that, you know, this was a staged scene. I go back to my statement I made earlier about Rocky Flats. I mean, to take someone up and kill them at the point where Tom's remains were found, which was very, very high up, you know, on the other side of the valley, you know, at this mountain peak where Tom had been found, there would have been, it just is very unlikely. It's certainly possible, but for someone to have taken his remains up there or taken him up there and killed him and then left the remains, I mean, certainly if you were trying to have someone not get found, I mean, that would be what you'd want to do, but Tom's remains were found by two elk hunters who were searching up there and came across the bones, and you know, it ended up being how they, you know, that's how they were found. But the fact that Keith was writing this manuscript, this sort of chapter, musing on suicide and the reasons behind, from a first-person perspective, it's a character talking about, you know, justifying suicide.
Yeah.
So it makes you question whether during that 5 days, which I'm probably leaving an important part out here, one of the things that I found, because we do have sort of the dates that, you know, on the documents themselves of when, you know, Keith at that time was using, you know, word processor, you know, one of the old 80s, you know, an IBM computer. And during, you know, in that word processor document, this allegedly had been written that week that he disappeared. So so if Tom's remains were found 5 days before, and Keith was generating this document and writing these few pages that same week. Yeah. After he knew that Tom Young had been found, the theory was that, you know, he had committed suicide. Even during that time, you know, and Keith himself actually attended Tom's funeral, which was on a Wednesday, was on that week, which was interesting. And some of the statements that I was able to read, that during research that was done, you know, things back in the 80s and 90s, is that Keith, it's been said that Keith was overly emotional during Tom Young's funeral, which is curious because for somebody who didn't know Tom that well. But again, this is a statement from a prominent member of the community back in 1988 who was at the funeral. And I know the gentleman who presided over the service, and over Tom's funeral, and actually I actually have a recording of it in the film, part of it in the film, that he was able to capture it. But point is that, you know, this is, it's very, very curious about Keith's motivations. And what's even more curious, and this is what I'm skating around a little bit, is Tom's motivations, because I have statements from people who knew Tom extremely well, who talked to him in his final days, and he was doing a little bit of the same thing. Oh, wow. Interesting. So it's a very bizarre case. Whether these two things are linked, they definitely, people get upset about it. You know, this was not linked and nothing. They absolutely were linked. Now, they were linked because Keith linked them. That's the thing we definitely can say. Keith absolutely was fascinated with this case. Yeah. And he, you know, spent an inordinate amount of time researching and writing from a fictional place about it. So that day that he headed out, August 7th, around 5 o'clock in the evening to take this alleged hike, was he thinking of suicidal thoughts too at that point, as the final lines in his writing suggest? I mean, they literally say that he walked off towards the mountain and understood what he had to do.
Wow.
And so a lot of people have wondered whether his writing is some sort of elaborate suicide note. I wouldn't say that that's where my head is at. I would say that at the end of the day, if I had to give my opinion now based on all of the evidence and just everything, looking at everything completely soberly, I think that Keith did, in fact, go up naively at the wrong time of day. He had been drinking heavily
Oh,
the
really?
night before, by the way. Oh, yeah, there was a major party.
Mm-hmm.
There was a certain individual who was spending a lot of time with him. It was a woman who I have talked to extensively as well, and that she, talks quite a bit about what they talked about, and he wasn't talking about Tom Young or anything like that. They were having a huge party at the KP that night, and Keith, they had definitely gotten drunk, and Keith was a big drinker, by the way. I wouldn't say not an alcoholic. He actually was trying to stop drinking, but he definitely liked the party. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So the next day, I think he was hungover. He was not of his full faculties, and even Tiffany has told me she just doesn't find it. How is it possible that she'd seen her dad laid out on the couch, after drinking so much beer the night before or something, and the fact that imagining him trying to climb a mountain the next day, she's like, it just doesn't make any sense, especially after he had this horrible incident I told you about where he was almost going to have to get a rescue team to come get him because he was so terrified up there. Now, why the hell would you set off at 5 o'clock to scale this mountain?
Yeah.
And then he literally made comments to people, well, if I don't come back, send out the search party. I mean, that's something you'd say to somebody, hey, if I don't come back, send a search party. That's like just a phrase.
I tend to think that
amusing.
I tend to think that it was suicide as well, but I can't. That's kind of a strange comment if it was suicide too, to send the search party. He wanted to make sure he was found.
That's part of the problem. That's part of the problem and the challenge of this is that, one way you think you got it figured out and you're looking at one way, and there's always something to fly in the face of it.
Yeah.
And I would say that if it was not an accident, that I also think that it's possible it was a suicide as well. However, I lean much more heavily towards the accident theory and bizarre coincidence theory. I know that's not as exciting for people, but I just have to be honest about my opinions. Now, as for Kai Reinhard still believes it was a murder. Astrid, his first wife, sort of teeter-totters, as she has told me, between what she really thinks happened. But, she seems to err more on the side that there was something more to it, that there was something nefarious towards it. And Tiffany, I think, I don't want to speak for these people. I'm just telling you what I've been told. And Tiffany seems to be more on the side of it's like me, like it's an accident. But at the same time, she also, like me, feels that there could be something more to it too. So it really is interesting opening this up and talking. There's such it's this maze of mirrors of theories, and your willingness to look down this rabbit hole will continue as far as you want it to go. And I think that's part of what makes the film is a little bit of an examination of how stories, how you start from a mystery, and when you don't have answers, how the family, the people in the town, and people in the media and such create their own answers to explain what happened. And it becomes this sort of elaborate folklore mythological story, which I'm leaving out a lot of things because I don't want to give it away, but there's other stories in Silver Plume's past that are where people have one incident happened, there was suicide or a murder, or suicide becomes a murder theory, becomes a ghost story. So we're witnessing basically Keith Reinhard and Tom Young's, the creation of this legend in the mountains, with their deaths being sort of casting this extremely long shadow. And I think that is why my film, Dark Side of the Mountain, is what its main prerogative is.
Yeah. So, something we both want to address, which is sort of the elephant in the room. You've worked on this documentary for years, and the film itself is now completed, but it isn't easy to just sell a documentary. In fact, I had no idea everything that you have to do and things that have to happen in order to get a film sold until I met you. So I know you have to get tired of people asking you, but tell us why the documentary isn't out and what are your plans for it?
I think the biggest mistake I made initially starting this was advertising that I was making it.
Yes.
Because, there's so many years of research that have gone on. And to be honest, as you noted, the film is completed. I have a completed finished cut of the movie, mixed and colored and all. It's beautiful. And I'm extremely happy with it. However, there are elements, mainly financing, that is going on right now. We've been talking to several people about it for a long time. And all I can really tell you right now is that there is an ongoing financer I'm talking to, and I'm hoping it goes the right way. If it doesn't, then I have a plan B. But right now, essentially, we have finishing funds that we're trying to raise for the film. And that's one of the most difficult processes of, getting a documentary film made. But, from the beginning, it was myself and one of my producing partners who financed the film together, self-financed the film. So this has been a passion project from day one. And we advertised early on that we were making the film and, put up social media for the film. So now we're very grateful for all the interest because it's, it's extraordinary and you want that. At the same time, because there's, the issues with financing that we're dealing with currently, as well as there's a few people I'm still trying to lure into this. And if I need to, get those people, if I'm able to get those people to add them into the film, I'm going to. But it's one of those things that with documentaries, you're never quite, you don't. I don't want to be watching this years from now and say, hey, I wish I did this or I wish I did that. Because, I'm not looking to make a sequel unless Keith is found, which I myself, and it sounds, kind of crazy to say now, I have spent many years wanting to accomplish that. I mean, we were up there searching for remains. I mean, I wanted, you started making a documentary with a certain set of intentions. You're interested in the story. You're interested in this town, and then you become part of the story. Yeah. And this thing takes on a life of its own, and especially when it's a self-financed project, these things can take many years. So I appreciate everyone's patience, but I can assure you the film absolutely will be released, and I'm hoping it will be soon, but I've been keeping very tight-lipped, my entire team has, because there's certain things that we don't want to talk about, and honestly the only reason I'm talking to you right now about it is because you're a friend of mine and I would love to talk to you, but I've generally been keeping kind of quiet about it until we have updates on the financing.
Yeah, I appreciate because you've told us so much more than the Unsolved Mystery segment for sure, and this wasn't just a man. This isn't just a man walking up a mountain one day. There's so many layers to this story.
There are, and I just want to reiterate that there is a massive amount that will come out about this case, that we've done, so much more research than even the sheriff's department has. It's a very small department, but when we first got started with them, I was sort of surprised that there was so little information, little knowledge from the lead detective on the case, and we were basically educating them on a lot of what the actual facts that were out there. So
Wow.
But I am very gracious to them for allowing us to, explore the files and go into depth on all of that. So, but it's been quite a process, and I just want to reiterate I appreciate everyone's patience on this, and that hang in there. We're gonna get it. We're gonna get it out there, and when we do, it's gonna be blow everyone's minds.
And you're a brilliant filmmaker, in my opinion. I've seen some clips, and it's cinematic. It's absolutely gorgeous what I've seen. And I actually have a copy of your My Amityville Horror, so people need to check that out as well. It's very interesting, especially if you're a fan of the movie. You'll find this interesting.
So, that's right. Yeah, it's a totally different case, but was a very, very difficult film to make, like all the documentary films are difficult to make. So each one of these projects are a big chunk of your life lived.
Yeah.
They sort of represent that.
Eric, it's been a pleasure as always. I'm honored to have you on my podcast. This is definitely the most in-depth look at this case anywhere so far, until your documentary comes out, that is. So I appreciate you chatting with me about it. Take care, and I'll have you on here again in the future, I'm sure.
That's right. Anytime, Heather, and I look forward to talking to you again when the film is released.
All right. Thank you. Take care. Bye.
All right, Heather. Thank you. Bye.
I will now give my thoughts on this disappearance. First off, I am fascinated at the possibility that Keith and Tom may have actually knew each other. Keith did arrive to live in Silver Plume well after Tom Young went missing. However, since Keith's closest friend had been living there, it is very possible that Keith had visited the small town years prior. If he had, he certainly would have encountered Tom Young, who owned a bookstore in the same building that Ted Parker owned. That would also explain Keith's children having memories of visiting Tom's bookstore if they had accompanied their father to Colorado. In my opinion, their friendship, or whatever it was, just adds an extra layer of mystery and may explain why Keith was so upset by his death. I don't think that there was any foul play involved. There's absolutely no evidence of that. We know of no one who would want to harm Keith, and he talked to a lot of people in Silver Plume, and by all accounts, he was alone and was seen headed toward the mountain alone that day. Plus, if he met with foul play, I think there would be a greater chance that he would have been found by now. I don't think that Reinhard was retaliated against because he was looking into Tom Young's death. I believe that Tom Young died of his own choice, and it was quickly ruled a suicide, and if that is truly the case, there would be no reason to retaliate. I guess I go back and forth between Keith wanting to end his life on that mountain or him perishing up there in a tragic accident. Keith was an educated person. According to Eric, he had just had a close call up there, and for him to go back shortly before the sun set to start a climb just isn't logical for someone who wanted to climb the mountain and then climb back down. Plus, he had no supplies with him. Is that because he knew he wouldn't need any supplies? Because he wasn't planning on returning from the mountain? The thing that gave me pause is him telling Ted Parker to call people to search if he didn't come back down. But there are a few ways that you could look at this. One is that if Keith didn't make it down on his own, he was confident that the rescue would find him in time. Another way was if he wanted to end his life, maybe he wanted to shield his family from knowing of his decision to do so. Perhaps he felt it would be easier on them to think that it was a tragic accident up on the mountain. Just because Keith Reinhard began a hike up the mountains in the late afternoon in itself doesn't necessarily mean that he wanted to end his life. I'm just looking at everything we know leading up to it. His obsession with Tom's case, creating a character in the book combining Tom and himself, being very emotional at Tom's funeral, and now knowing that Tom chose to end his life. I feel like reality was blurred between Tom and himself, perhaps due to the novel he was writing. If he as a writer wanted to experience what his subject was going through, did he want to experience this too? Another fact that leads me to believe that Keith's actions that day and him not emerging from the mountain were part of a plan. As I mentioned, Keith was writing a novel with his main character Guy Gibson said to be a cross between himself and Tom Young. The final haunting entry found in his novel before disappearing said, Guy Gibson changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. After writing this, Keith then walked into the mountains and never walked out. It seems more like a self-fulfilling prophecy than just an innocuous sentence in an unfinished novel. I also want to mention that we don't really know how things were in Keith's personal life before the disappearance. I think that it is important to talk about that when we were talking about one of the theories being suicide. The fact that Keith moved to Silver Plume for 3 months without his wife has always seemed strange to me. Of course, all couples are different, but after only being married 3 years, many couples wouldn't want to live several states apart for months. Is that just what they decided was best for them as a couple, or was there tension or problems between them that led up to that decision? If things were bad in Keith's marriage, could that have played a role in the decisions that he made while he was in Silver Plume? Keith Reinhard seemed to be at a crossroads. Getting ready to turn 50, along with the disappearance and recovery of Tom Young, seemed to affect Keith Reinhard in a way that no one expected. Was Tom's suicide ultimately what made Keith Reinhard walk into the mountains that day and never return? Was Keith struggling with some things known only to him, and did he make the decision that day to hike up the mountains and never return? Or was he so focused on conquering his fears that he impulsively set out to climb the mountain that day, disregarding the time of day or supplies that he would need? And did he become trapped in a place where he could never be found? There is always hope, however slim, that one day the mountain will give up its secrets. If so, perhaps we will know then whether Keith Reinhard was troubled or trapped. Once again, a special thank you to my friend Eric Walter for joining me for an exclusive look at this mysterious case. I will have him back before the documentary is released so he can tell us more of what he has uncovered. Please also check out his website with a lot of additional photos and information at darksidedoc.com. In finishing this podcast, I'd like to share a quote by Keith Reinhard that is foreboding considering what happened that last day. He wrote, "Once you know death, once you've accepted it, the fear is gone. All that remains is the anticipation." That concludes my podcast on Keith Reinhard. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review where you listen to your podcast. I am on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, YouTube, and YouTube Music. You can find all of my original articles, as well as links to my most recent podcasts, on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. I have social media pages under that name on X, Facebook, and Instagram. I also have a Patreon channel under Lost and Found Podcast, where I have several podcasts on lesser-known missing persons cases that you should check out. You can reach me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.